Welcome to Fragmented, a software developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better developers. My name's Donn Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show. Hey everybody, before we get going, I wanted to tell you about a brand new resource that I released. It's called Mastering Git. It is a free Git course that will teach you everything that you need to know on how to use Git from the ground up in less than 120 minutes. It's super easy to follow. You don't need any specific tools installed other than Git itself. I'll teach you everything you need to know from the ground up using the command line and the 20% of commands that are going to give you over 80% of the benefits for you and your day-to-day engineering career. Now, there's a ton of Git commands out there. You may not be sure which ones you should use. I've been using Git for over 12 years now from the command line, and these are the distilled down commands that I use on a day-to-day basis. I'm going to show you how to use each one of those, from initializing repositories, making commits, how to create branches, conceptually what are branches, how do they work, branch naming strategies, how to merge, how to utilize merge tools, how to handle merge conflicts, how to merge branches, how to create pull requests on things like GitHub, how to cherry pick, how to view logs, how to create aliases, and so forth. I cover all of that within this course. There's no fluff in it. We hop straight into it, and you're going to learn everything that you need to know in order to become a master of Git. Again, there's not a lot of commands that you're going to learn. This is the course that I wish that I had when I started. Doesn't matter if you're a beginner or if you're advanced, you're going to learn something for this. However, if your team member is new, or you're just learning Git, or you want to be able to kind of understand it better, this is the course for you. So check it out. The link is going to be in the show notes. You can also view it at donnfelker.com/git. You'll be able to see a nice demonstration of what is inside of that course on that page, and it'll link you directly to the actual video itself, which is free on YouTube. So you can also visit my YouTube channel, which is going to be at donnfelker.com/YouTube. You can find it there too. So again, go to donnfelker.com/git for the free Git course and learn Git and master it. And I really hope that it helps you. Let's hop into the show. All right, Kaushik, here we are again, back. Glad to have you back on the call. We had a couple of weeks off, just intermittent schedules, but hey, back in the action.
That we are. And I basically pinged you the other day saying I had a rant I want to get out, and I need you to sort of hear me out and make sure I'm not going crazy.
Yeah, right. So let's hop right into it. What is that rant? I know that you kind of give me, for the listeners here, you'd given me a brief synopsis before, and I said, you know what, let's just hop on the call and record it, and just we'll kind of get the raw discussion, which I think is usually much more valuable. So what is that?
Okay, so here's my thing. When we started out as Android developers, I think we started in a place where we didn't have enough tooling. There wasn't an opinion on architecture. There weren't pieces. And so I think rightfully, as Android developers, we obsessed over it, right? And we spent a lot of time. We tried to come up, we were working against the system, if that's a way to put it. And we came up with our own architectures. And I think it improved the Android developer community for the better. You know, a lot of the tools that we have, a lot of like the patterns that we have, admittedly are much better than what I've observed in my brief time as an iOS developer, right? And I think that was the place that we're in. And I think as time has marched on, you know, Google has made improvements. I think as a community, we've all come together. Like, you know, unidirectional stateflow is something that I guess everyone's talking about now. You know, everyone's using it. Everyone's happy with it. But I think what's happened is we haven't sort of, if you think about that pendulum swinging in a direction where one direction is like focus on the architecture, try to get the innards of your architecture nice and clean, that the code is good. And on the other side, it's like, I don't care, just make the product better. Like, you know, like damn the code, like the quality of the code. Let's just make sure that the app is buttery smooth. Throw in anything that you need to do to make the app function well. And I know that's obviously a slight simplification of the problem. But if you think about the pendulum swinging from one direction to the other, I kind of think it's time for us to swing a little in the other direction, which is as Android engineers, we need to like focus more on building better product, right? And I know this is a hot take, right? And I know, trust me, I completely see both sides of the argument, but I'm starting to feel, and I have 3 separate instances and we can talk about this, but I've had 3 instances where we have started to not swing back in that direction. I find myself caught constantly in arguments with Android engineers about how, oh, but we can improve this architecture further. We can do X. Maybe we should add more convention. Oh, it needs to be more similar. Like things are starting to diverge. And I'm like, who the bleep cares, right? At a certain point, just is your product better? If you have clean architecture, but your product still sucks, it isn't serving anyone, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is simplification. Let me stop then. I can talk to you about the specific instances that I ran into. But what are your brief thoughts? Like, hear me out. Am I sort of over obsessing about this? Am I?
No, you're not over obsessing. In fact, I've noticed a very similar thing that various clients that I've been to, companies, products I've worked on over the years have just got more and more complex. And we had a discussion over text regarding this, and we'll get into that a little bit more about my thoughts on what, like, some architecture is not actually architecture. It's getting around some problems we have in the tooling and processes. But I have seen a problem simply because, hey, this one person said that we should do it this way, and because for whatever reason it looks like a good idea, we should do it because it avoids one problem. But that then could expose you to a whole bunch of other issues, which is, I don't even know how this thing works. I can't even decipher how this app works half the time. But before we get down that whole rabbit hole, I kind of want to rewind to one thing that you said that I would like maybe you to expand on a little bit. And that's where you said focusing on product, building a better product. Can you expand on what you mean by building a better product?
Yeah. And this is basically you giving me the rope to hang myself. Because, I know I'm going to get into like very fiery takes here, but whatever. Like, I'm just going to say what it is, and I'm open to having my mind changed here. By building product, as an example, right? I've had the great opportunity at Instacart to observe both iOS and Android engineers, right? Because I've led both of those teams, and I've seen how one team functions over the other. When you actually release a feature, part of what makes software engineering complex is all of these small edge cases from a product perspective, right? And I don't mean like blatant bugs, but I mean like, hey, when you click something and it transitions into the next screen, is it transitioning okay? When you have items on your list and you keep scrolling really fast, right? And you like load a whole bunch of items, does it flash? Like, do the animations get like mangled up? For example, I don't know if you notice it, but with recycler views, like, if you use the default animations, it kind of works sometimes, but if you sometimes the default animations don't fit the theme, right? And I don't want to, like, that's another whole topic altogether, but that's just one example. If I observe an iOS engineer, they will try their best to make sure all of those things are like cleaned up, right?
Yeah.
But that same PR, if I, that pull request, when I see it on the Android side, what they're obsessing over is like, oh, like, hey, you use this pattern slightly differently, right? Like, this should be like immutable or mutable. And like, yeah, I'm not saying all of those things are wrong, but if you were to basically apportion the amount of time that an Android engineer spent reviewing code, I think an iOS engineer would pull that up. Like, actually, and I'm not saying Android engineers don't do this. There's always folks, but the obsession over like, oh, but like this architecture has to be followed this way. Like, the intention is this way, so we should use it. That's what I mean, right? Like, eventually what you observe is a better product. And that's one data point. The second data point is obviously, there's a lot of Twitter conversations going on. And I think it's fair to say that the third-party app ecosystem is better on iOS than it is on Android, right? And
what do you mean by that? The third-party ecosystem is better? Like,
if you were to pick third-party apps, like, if
like a video editing app.
Yeah, a video editing app, or even, the one that I use like as a good example is RSS readers, right? Yep. Niche, but I can guarantee you there are like some I can recommend. There are like some amazing iOS reader apps, right? RSS apps. Reader is one of them. Reader is actually it's a beautiful app, by the way. And you can say, well, that's just an exception. Maybe that one developer decided to make it their life's mission to build the best RSS reader, and that's why you have a good product. I don't think that's true, though. Like, I can cite so many examples of third-party applications built for iOS that are just like beautiful, right? Doing the same thing on Android, I don't want to say it's not possible. It's more difficult, right? And this gets into that whole, I wrote a blog post about this some time back as a response to one of those things that, Ben Thompson, who's this pundit who basically came up, he writes this newsletter called Stratechery. He came up with this idea, and he's sort of like taken that back and adapted his position, which is like, initially he was like, oh, Android developers are lazy. That's why they don't build good product, right? And I vehemently disagree with that, right? Android engineers do have it harder. It is harder to build better Android apps across the system because we have to battle with like a lot of APIs, right? Like, from API, 14, min, SDK, 14 to whatever it is today. That's complicated. I get that. But also, if, I think it's fair to say that if I have the latest, greatest Pixel phone or Galaxy 21, whatever, or 22, whatever it is, the latest version of that app should almost be equal, if like not better than the same on an iOS app, right? And iOS also, they're starting to have like a whole bunch of iPhone versions and different sizes. I'm rambling a little and I feel I might be going tangential, but does that give you a sense of what I mean? And I want you to push back if you feel like, oh, maybe I'm just generalizing here, right? Because I kind of think it's easier to find better iOS apps than it is. Give me the best Android app you've used, and I'll give you the best iOS app, or like you give me the best iOS app you've used. Compare the two, there's a huge difference. That's one way to compare it. The other way to compare it is, let's take the same apps, like, let's take Twitter on iOS, Twitter on Android, or like take equivalent apps that have both an iOS and Android version and compare the two, right? More often than not, I think there are a few exceptions, right? For example, like Square Cache, like beautiful app, right? And I found that to work great on both platforms. The Android one is really good. But just in general, right? Like most things, Twitter for the longest, I think Twitter is like in a sort of in a better position today, but it was very evident to me, right? I had very specific examples in the past where the same thing on the iOS app versus the Android app, like huge difference, right? Between the two. I don't know. What do you think? Am I maybe being a little biased here?
No, you're not being biased. And I don't know if I've even announced it here on the podcast. I feel like I have, but I don't use Android as my daily driver. I use iOS as my daily driver. And that may come as a shock for those that don't know that. But the way that I explain it to people is that I got tired. Well, let me rewind a little bit. I have been a user of Android since it came out, since the first G1 T-Mobile device came out. I had 2 of those, and I was loyal to the platform until 2 years ago. And I didn't get crappy devices. I had Pixels or I had Nexuses, whatever, I had the ones from Google. And I upgraded all the time. But what I always noticed is that within 8 to 10 months, I would want to throw my phone against the wall because apps would just lock up. My phone would turn into like a piece of charcoal that's like burning hot at all times. The battery would just tank, which battery is a problem across both platforms. I'm not going to let iOS get away from that too, but so I said, and I spoke to numerous people about this and saw some people that went from Android to iOS and talked to them. And I had worked with some Android developers that used iOS. I'm like, whoa, what are you doing? And they're like, dude, it just works better. And I'm like, no way. And so finally I got to the breaking point and I was up in Connecticut. I had a client and I walked to the Apple store one day because I just wanted to take a look at stuff at lunch. And I just looked at the iPhones and I'm like, you know what? Today's the day. And I just bought one right there. I didn't plan on it. I just did it. And from that day forward to then, I still have that same exact phone. That was over almost over 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, almost. It's the same exact device. The only thing that I have a problem with is the battery life's not that great. But I'll tell you what, man, I have no issues with it. And that's the device, but the apps work really, really well. And I attest that to multiple different things. Like you said, the way that I think a lot of iOS developers approach apps is like they set their standard to the way that Apple does things. And when Apple releases an app, a device, or whatever, it's usually very polished. Now, of course, they're not without their own faults, but it's very quite polished. It works, rarely ever crashes, and things are just very fluid-like. And it feels like a lot of developers try to mimic that, which then in turn creates these great applications. Now, I don't know well, I have an opinion here. I have a feeling based upon my interactions with iOS teams that their architecture is all over the place or just non-existent at all.
Oh yeah.
And on the flip side of that, we have Android, where we sometimes care about the way the app looks and responds, and we're just like, you know what, whatever, ship it, which I'm also been a proponent of and guilty of telling everybody to do, just ship it and get it out there. But I feel like on the other side, and I think you maybe had touched on this a little bit, we have really dove deep, and in my opinion, too far into the deep end of overuse of architectures. And that has become something that's actually slowed us down. And we've spent too much time being software craftsmen or craftswomen, craftspeople, whatever you want to say, than actually building a product that the end user wants to use, likes to use, and enjoys to use.
I think that last sentence really captures it well, because I'm seeing evidence of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, I had two teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
Both of these teams building the same feature, and the architecture that we talked about, the unidirectional stateful,
Yeah.
I managed to get both teams onto that architecture. So both use a very similar architecture, right? And it's funny, the conversations I have, because, there are different variants of the unidirectional stateful architecture, right? Like there's the one that we talked about in the podcast, that I talked about in a presentation. And inherently, it's very similar to MVVM, right? A lot of people come back and say, oh, well, that's just MVVM. And I'm like, yeah, that's the point. I wanted it to be that similar so you don't have to learn something new,
Mm-hmm.
right? The iOS people, getting them to change was a pain in the butt. But once they changed, they've just stuck to it, right? And they were like, okay, this is it. We're not going to obsess more over it. The Android engineers, I find them constantly obsessing. Oh, can we abstract this class? Oh, how do we make sure that the convention's better? And
we're repeating this thing twice. Let's extract it into a helper function and make an extension function and put it into a module. I'm like, what are you? Jeez.
Right. And there are times that then it makes sense, but I'm like, why are we obsessing about this? Who cares if people don't use the pattern exactly the same way across 20 different files, right? Who cares? I've had engineers come up to me, Android engineers come up saying oh, maybe we should start using different frameworks, right? Maybe we should start using something. I mean, Uber Ribs is taking it to an extreme
Mm-hmm.
where it's complete convention driven. But should we think about Mavericks? Or should we think about in one of the Instacart also open source this thing called Formula. It's should we start moving to Formula? And my whole point is wait, why are we having this conversation? What is limiting today?
What
is the problem, right? Why is you can spend all the time, trying to migrate again, but what is your problem? Your problem is that everyone isn't following the same thing. That isn't important. If I bring in a new engineer, if I rope in someone who can write Kotlin code and ask them to help on fixing something, they should be able to pick it up and start working. That's more important to me, right? It isn't important to me that your entire code base looks exactly the same, right? Who cares? Is the product any better? No. But you moving to a different framework, is the product better? No.
Mm-hmm.
iOS still is building a better product. They're using the same architecture. What's your excuse now, right? And I feel it's hard to snap people out of that thought process, right? And that's the thing that I'm finding challenging. And I don't know, maybe it is just over time that will change. But I'm sensing that. I feel people just need to snap out of the whole, if you have something that works better enough, and you can always improve on things. You can have comments, but that you shouldn't obsess over that. You should obsess over that after you've taken it to the point where the product, you need to enable a better product by using these architectures. If you don't have a good reason to do that, we shouldn't be spending as much time talking about it.
Yeah, there's so many architects, and you mentioned this. There's so many architectures that you'll run across in a code base sometimes, because early on it's hey, this was back in the day, we didn't have anything. It was just fragments and not even fragments. We didn't even have fragments back in the day. For some people, don't even know that there was no fragments for a long time.
I remember.
There's just activities, and you put your code into. We had the MVP pattern back then. Actually, that's what we used to help create abstractions. And there's still some of that code lying around. And then fragments came around, and we did that. And then we had MVP for MVP, and then then MVI came around, and then it was MVVM. And so on some code bases, you'll find multiple different patterns in use. And there are valid use cases for some of that, because, hey, as this product matured, we realized, hey, that wasn't a good way to do it. It was very painful to update. It was very painful, blah, blah, blah. So I get that. But at some point, like you said, you get to a point where you've created almost like this ecosystem at a company that allows you to ship something. Now, maybe it's not the perfect, and I won't name the client, but I had a client that years ago that had that exact thing. Their app was very well architected. It worked very well, but the problem was it was very difficult to understand to get going with. So once you kind of understood it, then you can be productive in it. But when a new engineer joined, there was about a 2 to 3 month ramp up period of a lot of WTFs going on. Like, what is this? Like, no, we're not using MVVM. No, we're not using these like view binding. No, we're not. We do this all of ourselves because we've built it before all that came out. Now, there was a benefit to that because the product could then continue to move forward and we didn't have a lot of churn. The negative aspect of that, though, was having, not being on a modern framework and not being, when new developers, let's take a look at, like, if you look at a funnel, right? There's more new developers than there are senior developers. Senior developers at the bottom of the funnel. That's just the nature of it. So if you have more new developers, it would make more sense to have a framework which is somewhat modern so they can kind of hop in and understand it. But I think there's a fine line in what that is. Is it too much or what is too much? So we continue to riff on this for a while, but I mean, you had brought up a couple of those points before the call. Did you want to hop into some of those?
Yeah, I can mention there were 3 instances that, where I noticed this. One was, I didn't get permission from this person. They're a designer at Google, so I don't want to necessarily say it out loud for, fear of repercussions for, But yeah, that was a back and forth I was going with them. And because I put out a tweet pointing out something similar in the past, right? Where I'm like, oh, the third-party app ecosystem is better. And, to their credit, they were like, hey, let's talk about this. Like, tell me more. Like, because you also mentioned that, Android development, you enjoy Android development better. And that's true. I do enjoy writing Kotlin code more than, some of the things, constructs you have to deal with on iOS, right? And I know there was a back and forth. And I think that's the same thing, right? Like, you pointed out something that actually gave me sort of like an aha moment right now, which is there aren't enough examples maybe, right? Like what are like the beacons, like what, and I'd love to hear from the listeners, if you were to pick which is the best Android app from a product perspective that you used where you're like, geez, I wish I could build my app like this, right?
It's just works so well.
Yeah, stellar examples. It can be either from Google or like a third party. Because, if you ask me on the iOS side, I can throw off at least 3 or 4 immediately off the top of my head that I know are excuse my language, effing phenomenal, right? Like I can give those examples out and maybe I might be biased because again, like you, I use both an Android and an iOS phone, but right now I've switched towards my iPhone being the primary driver, right? So please tell me, I want to listen, what are the best Android apps that you've used from a product perspective, right? That are just beautiful, fluid, are just flawless. I want to hear those examples, right? And I think you pointed out that if there are more of these things, then we have a standard to build towards, right?
Yeah.
And maybe that's the problem. We don't have enough of those. I don't know, if I were to ask you, what were some of the best Android apps you've used?
It's that question. It goes back to the Google apps, and that's not the answer to your question. It's like YouTube, it works well. Gmail, it works. And I think that's the key component there. It works. I don't have any issues with it. That has always been my big downfall with a lot of Android apps. Sometimes they just won't work, and it's very frustrating. And there's been a few websites, which I won't name any of them right now, but there's a number of websites out there that post hey, here's a very good designed, app, and they give you good inspiration.
Right.
But unfortunately, off the top of my head, I can't say, hey, these are phenomenal Android apps. Now, there's, again, some things that Android does a lot better that I love, like the notifications in Android below iOS notifications out of the water, hands down. But that's not an entire app. That's just a feature.
All right. Anyway, that was one data point. And again, listeners, if you have better examples, please send it. The second is, I think I was telling you, right? I was talking to one of the engineers that I work with, right? And they were saying the same thing. They're like, oh, should we start exploring some other frameworks so we can bring in more convention so that people don't find it difficult and start using the pattern incorrectly? And that was the thing. I was like, wait, what do you mean? How incorrectly is it being used? Is it getting to the point where it's actually detrimental to the core where the product is better?
Yeah.
If not, it's you send up a PR review, just point it out in a PR review, let them change it, right? Because what you're trading off is what you mentioned, which is like the ease of change, right? And we've talked about this in previous podcasts. A very big rule of thumb for me is if I get a competent Android engineer to look at my code base and I ask them to change something in a screen, it shouldn't take more than a few hours for them to be able to do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you bring in like and this complexity is the main thing, right? Like you bring in this complex architecture where in addition to learning the bajillion Android things that we have, the APIs that we have, you also have to learn this new framework that you tack on to this for your architecture. And then you have to understand the implementation about how it's used and make a change. That's a problem, right? That's wasteful. If on the other hand, you have this architecture that's a little loose, that doesn't have as many tight conventions, but the advantage is if you bring in someone to come and look at the code base, they can start working on it quickly and improving the product. That's a much bigger benefit, right? So that was like my second data point. And I think the third data point was this whole Twitter conversation that's going on, right? Where if you look at a bunch of the iOS developers, the conversations, like, the coffee conversations that go on with iOS developers, they talk about the APIs. They're like, oh, like what API did you use to get this like cool feature in, right? Like, oh, that's their obsession, which is like, oh, Apple hasn't provided this API. I'd like to do this really crazy cool thing where like, oh, how do we do this? How do you do this? Oh, that's where like the conversations spread. When I look at the coffee conversations that go on mostly with Android developers on, Twitter, for example, it's always like, oh, we should be using this for dependency injection or like, view models versus like, oh, this architecture, oh, we shouldn't be using view models. And I'm like, oh, I'm tired of this, right?
Yeah.
Like, who cares? Like we are at a point where we have something workable, or at least I like to believe so. Why are we not obsessing over? So that was like my third data point, right? So all put together, it sort of has gotten me thinking more about this idea that we should be focusing more on product. Like it's time, right? And I like to be proven wrong there. Like, I want to hear, I'm genuinely open to hearing the other side of it.
Yeah. So I think you're on something. We need to focus on building products. This is also transcends into the startup, solo founder, bootstrapper kind of area where there's a lot of conversations in that community about just getting something done and shipping it, get a good product out there and iterate, just move forward and get something done that's usable and so forth. And that's kind of what they talk about. Now, to kind of rewind a little bit about Android, one of the situations I think that we've ended up in is because Android has always been this blank canvas. From day one, we were given an activity and Hello World was literally some gray text on a black screen in the top left corner. And that was it. Like, there it is. Put a button. Cool. The button shows up next to it or below it, depending on what layout you were using. That was like, okay, how do you want your app to look? I don't know. How do you want it to look? There was really no guidance. And so we have had over the last decade, a plethora of guidance from, third party as well as Google saying, here's how you should build applications. And you kind of have to look at the ego investments of each individual participant in those conversations. Google's going to say it one way because they believe that's a good way to build it. But why do they believe it? Maybe because it's easy for them to update libraries. Maybe it's easier for them to ship updates, or maybe that's just they want to save face so it looks like they're planning something. Who knows? I'm not at Google. I don't know. Now, another company might say, hey, you need to use this framework and this is why it works well. And the reason why they're doing that is because they're at, Facebook, Uber, Twitter scale, whatever, and they run into problems that 99% of us will never run into. But they need to do that because that's the problems they have. And the problem that I have, it's not really a problem, but I think it's something a lot of people don't recognize is they can't see that is what those companies are doing. They're solving for a very specific scale problem that they have. And it could be a human resource scale, which is we have 2,000 developers on our Android app. So we're having a hard time with this many Git commits. And so we have to break it apart, and which means we got to break apart our modules and blah, blah, blah. That then turns into, oh, I need to do that because that's what company X is doing. And then we have, other individuals which kind of come at it maybe a more pragmatic approach. Hey, you don't need to break this apart into this type of architecture. You just need to use something very simple like this. And so there's arguments all over the place. And then, which is the kind of the final straw, in my opinion, is that Android has a situation, and I'm probably going to portray this incorrectly, and I hope I don't, but we talked about this over text, is in my opinion, a lot of the quote unquote architecture that we see out there is actually to get around problems with build tools and so forth. So we find a lot of companies, or I find a lot of companies will, hey, have a ton of, Gradle modules because that's the right architecture. But if we really break it down to what's happening is like, oh, we have all these different modules because we want to make sure that we're not rebuilding 100,000 files over and over and over every time we do something. We want to use maybe the Gradle cache. So we're breaking apart things into different modules. We're using Gradle Enterprise and we're caching things and stuff to speed up the build. That's just the nature of the build situation. I personally don't call that architecture. Maybe that's build architecture. Totally get it. But actually developing the application into these different modules just because it's a logical component sometimes doesn't make sense to me. Like, all right, does that really buy us any net benefit? Now, if it does for build speed, which increases developer productivity, all for it. Cool. That's just the nature of Android that we have to get around. I'm talking about a whole bunch of different things here. The long story is, I think it's just because Android has come from a place where we haven't had any guidance. Now we have guidance from all over, and we're kind of picking and choosing what we need to have. And I think a lot of developers are really still trying to grasp what's the best architecture. I need to look to industry leaders to maybe I should use that one, or maybe I should use this one, instead of actually focusing on like, hey, are we building this feature, this screen? Is it doing what it should be doing? Is it fast? Is it quick? Does it solve the user's problem of them entering or reading text or whatever they're trying to do? And, is it maintainable? And I think there's a lot of confusion on spending. As developers, we like to spend a lot of time in the code because it's easy. It's an escape mechanism for a lot of us. We feel comfort there. We can hop deep into the code. We can lose hours of time, and it's fun. A lot of times it's not fun to just build a product that's a certain screen that maybe I don't really care about, but the product team does. So I think there's multiple facets here at play.
Yeah. You brought up another point that also a tube light in my head sort of lit up, which is, I think in the Android world, a lot of the guidance that comes from the Android developer community is from a lot of these extremely super competent, amazing Android engineers who work at companies that have 200 engineers, right? And that's actually, I'm curious, how many companies exist that have more than 200 Android engineers? I mean, I work at Instacart, which is a pretty big company, right? Relative to a lot of other companies, we don't even go close to 100, right? Altogether. And I feel it's interesting because if you start seeking guidance from engineers who are having to deal a lot with these problems, right? Where you have 300 to 1,000 Android engineers, or your code base is that big, where you have 400 Gradle modules. Sometimes maybe we shouldn't be sort of adopting everything that they're mentioning, because that comes with certain cons, right? Which is being nimble. And it is, I don't know. Yeah. This got me thinking. There used to be a time where a lot of the indie developer community in Android, was pretty vibrant, and they would talk about a lot of that stuff. I don't see as much conversation from the indie developer community, right? It's a lot from these engineers who worked on really complex, big problems, right? And I am curious, it's a thought, right? I wonder what happened there, right? Is that just me being in my own bubble and not hearing from them, or are there genuinely conversations missing from that, right? Because I feel that's the other thing. If you hear a lot of these indie developers who are trying different things, their only way of capturing attention and gaining traction is by building really nice product, right?
It is,
or innovative or creative products. And I don't hear as many voices in the Android side there as I do on the iOS side.
Yeah, you're right. It's we actually have had a couple of people on the podcast over the years that were indie developers and did fairly well and did it as a full-time thing. And I'm going to say my sneaking suspicion here is that a lot of people have put out their apps or whatever and realized that it's not a build it and they will come solution. And there's not you have to solve a very particular problem. And nowadays it almost feels like you have to be cross-platform. I mean, it doesn't mean you have to write it in KAM or Flutter or whatever. It means you need to have an app on iOS and Android, which means at that point, if you're doing that, you're probably storing data on the server, which means you need a third app, which is your API, and then a fourth app, which is your admin panel. But I think what ends up happening is a lot of developers, they don't get disillusioned, but just they get discouraged. You write an app, you put it out there, it's really nice, but now you got to market it. Now you have to do all these things, and it can get really discouraging if you don't get any traction at all, because there's so many apps out there. And as someone who came from, I probably had, I don't know, right around 20 or more apps in the Android market. This is before Android, Google Play. This is Android market. I had 20 apps at least in the Android market in the first 1,000. I was very early. Back then, it was a different game. Like you just push an app out, it showed up at the top of the new list. You got 1,000 installs in an hour. Like boom, just happened. That doesn't happen anymore. You put it out there, you're like, oh, I got 4 installs in 4 weeks. There's so many more things out there. And I think when these indie developers were out there, like we did hear from them. We said, hey, here's how I built it, and here's how I made this nice product. And there's some of them that, because they have, like you said, they have to think about what makes good user experience. And one of the apps that me and you both use that we both love is Things on iOS.
Oh, yeah.
Like I wish there was a Things on Android. Is there a Things on Android? I don't think there is.
I mean, it's funny. At one point, I offered that, this is, I think, many years back, 5 or 6 years back. I offered to build the Things Android app for free, but Culture Code, the company, they're like this German company that built it. They're notorious for being like, in the Apple ecosystem. And it's funny. Recently, I was through this whole thing of like trying different apps again, because I wanted to move away from Things because, I use my Android phone as well. A very good app that, if folks are interested, is this new to-do app called Tick.
Yeah, I use that.
Tick is great. But again, I mean, this might just be like a product thing, but it doesn't compare. Like Things is such a gorgeous, beautiful, intuitive app, right? It's a to-do app. It's as simple, but it's just, that was like, if I were to pick some of the best examples of iOS apps, Things would be right up there, right? And there's a bunch of other really good ones too. But I genuinely am asking listeners, like, send us examples. And like, if there are indie developers who are like building amazing apps, we'll promote it. Like, I mean, I want to, right? Like, I want to get that indie voice out there. Like, there aren't enough of them. So please send them our way.
That TickTick was, I forgot about that. And that was one that I used a lot before I went over to iOS. And I use it on iOS too, because I have an iOS app too before I got into Things. Right. Because I was a big Wunderlist user for a long time.
Oh, I remember, yeah.
And then Microsoft bought it and shut it down. So thanks Microsoft.
Yeah. TickTick functionally is a great app. Like, if you want feature A, B, C, they got it. Like, they do a whole bunch of things, but Things is just, I keep coming back to Things because once you use Things and you're used to how intuitive it is as an app, it's hard. Like even Markdown editors, I forget the one. There was one that's really good. I hope, by the next episode I remember it so I can call out. There's a good Android Markdown editor. But
oh, really?
Yeah.
I was always looking for a good one back in the day.
Yeah, it's by that engineer from Square. It'll come to me at some point. But, if you ask me on the iOS side, there's like 4 Markdown editors and all of them are really good, right? Like IA Writer, the whole bunch of them. That's just, that's what I mean, right? Like, and these are indie developers. Like, in my mind, these are small companies. Like these aren't like, the 200 engineers working on this app. Where are those apps?
So
I want to hear from
those.
This
is a good
apps.
question here. Like, let's get into like what are some possible solutions here? And this is, I'm just throwing this out there, like not even planning this thought process. Is maybe the solution actually charging more for apps on Android and just putting out a really good app? And if you've seen this, I know I have. Sometimes if I want an iOS app that's really good, I'll look at it. It's like $29. I'm like, what? $29? And then before you know it, I'm clicking purchase because I'm like, I really like this app. Like I got a 7-day trial or whatever. I'm like, oh my God, I really love this thing. And I'm like, yeah, $29, totally worth it. Is that maybe the thing that needs to happen? Like indie developers or companies need to create such good user experiences that they can charge that same amount?
It's the catch-22 problem though, right? Like there are the common saying, or not the saying, but the trope is that Android users aren't willing to pay, but iOS users are. Therefore, it's just easier to invest in building a really high quality iOS app because there's a higher chance you'll get money for it, right? And I know that's what a lot of people say. I don't know. And maybe it is true. Like, that's the kind of thing that I feel like we need to find out more.
Yes, I don't.
Because there aren't enough paying Android users is the theme, right? For example, if someone says, okay, I'm going to charge like $10 for this, and you have like another shittier app that, they give away for free, then most people are going to pick the shittier app on the Android system. This is the trope. Again, I don't believe that, because for me, I would rather pay and use something good. But hey, like, this is what I hear from most people.
Yeah, and I've heard the same thing from other developers. It's not just us, that there's it's not a misconception. I think it's the actual culture of Android, of it being open and free. Everything should be free. But let's be 100% honest. Free does not pay the bills. And I think I've seen a few folks from JetBrains actually kind of that represented JetBrains say that, like, hey, JetBrains charges money for their IDEs because free doesn't pay the bills. Right. But at the same time, like you said, if there's two different apps, one is $9.99 and one is free, the one that's free is going to get a lot more uses. But at what cost, though? Eventually, it's going to stop getting updates. That person's going to get burned out on, updating it. And ads, people say, well, you can throw ads on it. Like, okay, ads work at scale. And I'm talking about millions and millions of impressions. I'm not talking about, hey, I got 10,000 installs and I'm generating, $5 a week. Like, that's not going to sustain you to want to update an app. So I don't know if it's charging that, which is kind of leads me to the next question is, how do you have any ideas on how to motivate or to, influence developers to focus more on product experience rather than, engineering and architecture? And not saying that architecture is bad, but like, hey, just put some more emphasis on building a good product.
I wish I did. Off the top of my head, I don't, because the obvious way is like, hey, if you build a good app, the people will come, right? But if the problem is that the people don't come, that's the conundrum that I find myself caught in. But I think like we can do things like, we can surface like, hey, if there's good indie apps, we'll surface them. We'll get those engineers, we'll get those developers to talk in the podcast. Like, that's one thing we can do. I think in general too, maybe that's something that Google, like I know Google has like some things where they highlight some of these engineers that work on things, right? I have mostly seen just the big sort of players. I've not seen as many indie sort of apps. Maybe that's something that, that can be done, which is like, hey, let's talk about these indie apps. Let's focus on indie apps and let's focus on like high quality apps, right? Like, let's focus on these APIs. Like that's what we need to be like, we don't need like, oh, look at this amazing, I don't know, coroutine API that does this thing under this condition with these two threads. Like, maybe less conversation there, but like, look at this API and look at how this API was used in this app. Like, look at how like gorgeous this.
Now, when you say API, do you mean like an actual platform API from a native one, like a Android native API or an iOS native API? Or are you talking about like an API to get data?
No, that's a good point. I specifically meant the former, which is a platform API that allows you to sort of build product in a specific way. Okay. Not the latter. Okay. That is like not to pull data.
Okay.
I mean like Android APIs, right? For example, that's the other thing. Swift recently, like, iOS, they literally made a keynote announcement about a charts API that they built, right? Which is like Swift. I think it was maybe Swift UI or something, but they're like, look at this charts API and like you can build beautiful graphs and we've made it easy. I would never imagine something like that from like, Google. Like, I mean, hey, even to this day,
it's needed.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like what's the best charting API? I still think it's like, what is it? MPU Android or I forget what it was, right?
MP chart or whatever. Yeah.
MP. Yeah. That's the kind of thing I mean, right? Like, hey, where are like those APIs that allow me to do that? Navigating. I know navigation was a big thing that they try to focus on with the fragments thing, but it's still kind of a pain, right? Like we still have these conversations about backstack and home button and back button. I don't know. And maybe I'm oversimplifying
No,
this
I
problem,
think
saying like, just, fix it. Just put up an API.
I think you're really onto something here though, because I'm gonna reference. I get run up a flagpole about this all the time. I'm gonna reference Ruby on Rails here because Ruby on Rails will do something very specifically for a while, and then what will happen is someone else in the community will build a gem or does something that's very awesome, and a lot of people will start using it, and then what will end up happening is internally, like on the Rails, it's open source. The open source team will then say, "Hey, this is interesting. We should pull this into Ruby on Rails." And that's happened a number of times. Like, hey, we're gonna pull it in, or we're gonna recreate it because it's something that's actually needed in the framework. And so I'm wondering, is maybe this is a issue further up that needs to be addressed? Like, is it something at Google level where, hey, maybe Google needs to open up a little bit more for Android? Say, hey, here's, there's this MP Android chart. Like, it works great. Why doesn't, like, they did that with Dagger kind of. They kind of pulled that in, and I'm not going to defend Dagger, but it's just
but you see, that's like, you're proving my point. They did that with Dagger, which is like
you're right.
dependency injection framework. How often do you find that for, like,
it's exactly.
Right?
I mean, that solves that problem, but like, it's like you said, charting, like that would be very useful. What are some of the other, I'm trying to think off the top of my head, some of the other platform APIs that would be really nice to have?
It's just like the biggest painful things if you think about it, right? Like, I know for a fact,
showing
to this
keyboard
day, navigation is still a pain in the butt. Like, I know there's app navigation and it's better. And, we actually do use it in one of our apps here. It's still not very intuitive though. Like, it's still not like just, I can use this and now my app navigates between screens in easy, fluid way. I don't think that's true, right? What's the other example? The charting API is like a good, obvious example, especially because it came from recent memory, right?
One of the couple of the things that on the flip side that I like to bring up is some of the things that were built just like almost like flopped. Like I don't even know anybody who uses instant apps. Do you?
No.
Like, that was pushed so hard.
And it was pretty cool too, I will say. I loved the feature, right? I like the idea. It was like set up to work great on Android because, but I don't think anyone uses it.
Yeah, it's like, I got to do all this extra work to make this thing an instant app, and I have to break these things into all these different chunks, and it created so much work. And there's been a number of those style of features that have come out where I think it was very specific to Android.
Right.
But
here's another example, right? Like Apple Pay versus Google Pay. Like, I remember just adding the integration for Apple Pay was, I don't think it was that pleasant because we were very early in adding it. Like, I think we partnered with Apple at that point to add it on the Instacart app. I still remember doing it on like the Google side was a pain for our engineers, right? They got it working, but even to this day, the experience is that much better. Like, that's what I mean. Like, the Google Pay API should be so freaking spanking awesome that you can just integrate it and it just all works beautifully, right? And then everyone uses it. But no, I mean, hell, they just made like a new Google Pay app now, right? Like, that's the other problem. Like, what am I supposed to use now? I don't know if that necessarily changed anything, so I might be unfairly criticizing that. But that's what I mean, right? Like, just good product, like good native product functionality.
And there's kind of a bummer too between both Android and iOS. There's a lot of things that I wish would cross over to both platforms, but both companies are just, are so against each other in a lot of things that they're never, like, to give you the prime example, I love iMessage. It works great. And I love how it integrates with the Mac. I just wish I could use it on a PC or I could use it on Android. If that was available, that would be, and then if I could integrate into it with apps, that would be such a game changer all over the place,
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I mean, best of luck.
Yeah.
They're Apple, knowing who they are, they were going to hold, like, you can take that from their like cold, dying, clinging hands, or whatever the metaphor is. Apple, that definitely isn't happening, right?
Yeah.
But point taken. I think that, and I don't want to sound like I'm shitting over Google completely, right? Like, they've definitely done some things really well. Things have improved. But I want to like say like, hey, maybe it's time you change direction again, like where we're not obsessing over like how to blueprints for architecture. Like, great, like, let's just move past that. We have enough direction there. How do we build better products, like better apps?
Yeah, That's a perfect segue into something I just wanted to bring up, which probably could be its own episode, and we'll just briefly touch on it here. But building a good product is fundamental to the success of the app, to the company, to revenue, profit, whatever. And that product has to provide value, and then you have to be able to iterate on that. And the example here, you might be like, Don, why are you bringing this up? But I wanted to bring up the example of Notion moving from web views to native. And the reason why I want to bring that up is because, in my opinion, they have a very, very good product. And they iterated on it in the correct manner. They perhaps didn't have the right resources. They didn't take all their time and focus on, hey, we should build this perfect Swift app and this perfect Jetpack Compose app and do all these crazy architecture things. They looked at it, and I'm assuming I don't know anybody there. They probably looked at it and said, hey, we don't have all the resources to build 2 different apps. We don't even know what we need yet. So let's just wrap this thing in a web view and maybe add some notification support and ship it. And it's not the best, and it's kind of slow, and to be honest, it kind of sucks, but it works. But the value that the end user gets out of being able to have a Notion app, in quote, that's just a web view, is really valuable to the end user. And then Notion was able to say, hey, okay, it looks like these are the most popular screens, or this is the most popular flow through the app. Cool. Let's turn that into the native experience first, and then we'll start, adding other native features as time progresses. In my opinion, that is excellent execution on not focusing on architecture and everything else, and focusing on your product before you get too deep in the hole of software craziness. What are your thoughts?
You're absolutely right. That's my thoughts. And by the way, I know I was being snarky on Twitter, and I sort of put a comment there.
I wasn't sure how you were going to respond.
No, but you're absolutely right. I think you're spot on. I did that because I think everyone's allowed going crazy on Twitter, for a certain amount. So that's what I did. But I think you're absolutely right. That's a thoughtful way of approaching it, which is, look, iterate quickly on the product. Now we know what we need to build. Let's build the best version of it. Move those pieces to native. Mm-hmm. Boom. I'm completely with you on there. I think that's you phrased it correctly. That was well done by Notion there.
Cool. Glad you agree. I was a little worried. I wasn't sure how Kaushik was going to respond to that, everyone.
No, I mean, I was just being snarky. Okay, I'm right. Because again, that's the other thing. At this point, I think everyone globally is tired of the whole Flutter versus native versus React native argument. Yeah. At this point, I'm like, oh God, just use whatever.
Exactly. Just use whatever.
It's getting tiring, right?
I get that question all the time. On my YouTube, I have a YouTube video that's fairly popular for Flutter stuff, and I get that question all the time. Well, what should I use to learn it? I'm just just learn whatever you want to learn. If you love, and this goes into other episodes we've had. If you love learning about AI and machine learning, then go learn that. And if you want to write it in R or Python, then learn R and Python. If it's you love web development, learn web development. I don't care if it's React or Ruby or .NET. There's so much stuff out there for you to learn in so little time. You might as well do something that you enjoy, because you only got one life, so you might as well do things that you enjoy every day.
Yeah, there's that whole thing, right? We should think of ourselves first as striving to be programming expert, not language experts, yep. Right? Mm-hmm. At a certain point, the language should be less important.
Yeah.
We can have preferences, of course. We can be good at something, right? Even if sometimes the right tool is X, but if I'm so much more proficient in Y, maybe the right thing to do is to use Y versus X, right? And that's okay. I think these flame wars that constantly go on is starting to get a little annoying.
I had a friend of mine who he has a successful startup. I mean, he has multiple employees, and it's been active for multiple years. It's profitable. And I go to lunch with him every once in a while, and I asked him, he used to be a .NET guy, and he's a Ruby on Rails guy now. I said, all right, if you were to go back to when you started this company, what would you do differently? And he just looked at me immediately without hesitation and says, I would have never used Ruby on Rails. And I'm like, what? Why? And he goes, because the amount of time it took me to learn a new framework, because I thought that was the right thing to do, he goes, slowed me down too much. He goes, we probably would have been much further along financially, because I would have been able to ship features faster because I knew a different framework. He goes, if I were to start it now, he goes, I would just use Ruby on Rails because I'm familiar with it. He goes, but back then I didn't know the framework. I didn't know it. So just use what you know, build it, and then iterate.
Yeah. That's the kind of thought that needs to prevail more strongly,
Mm-hmm. Well, this is been a very interesting episode here. So I'm interested to see what the listeners have to say. So when this comes out, please, let us know on Twitter.
Yeah.
You can tag me and Kaushik, or even just the podcast itself, because we're interested to see what you think really good product apps are on Android. And really, we're looking for third-party ones, right, Kaushik?
Yeah. I mean, I'm anything at this point, but yeah, the third-party indie voices, like we definitely want to hear a lot of those apps. We want to see if we can help promote some of those things. And again, to your point, Don, I don't think this is gospel, by the way. I don't think we are saying that, hey, we are right, and therefore that's not what we're saying at all. We want to genuinely listen. Like, hey, give us pushback, send us like sort of competing thoughts. Maybe we might be thinking about some of these aspects wrong. Maybe there are examples. Maybe there's this whole ecosystem where like the Android indie developer community is just going haywire and like being successful. Like we want to hear about that. Tell us,
Yeah, exactly. We're just two people with our own opinions, and often we're wrong. So please let us know.
On that happy note, folks, if people want to reach out to you, Don, and give such thoughts, where should we do that?
They can yell at me on Twitter and on Instagram. Don Felker's probably the best way, or you can go to my website and send me a real nasty message there too. What about half the people want to get a hold of you? How do they do that?
I love it. Twitter is usually the quickest way, or my website, which, by the way, we should talk about that again. I changed my domain name again.
How many domain names are you on at this point? I don't think I told you this story on the podcast. One time, Kaushik went to overseas to visit his family. He goes, hey, I'm going to send you something. And I'm like, all right. And then I get this random package and it's got some weird domain on it that ends in .gg / something else with no instructions, no like, hey, Don, it's just this link with a piece of paper inside. I'm like, is this a bomb? Like, I don't even know what the hell this is.
In hindsight, I should have done I thought I was being very thoughtful, like by putting up like a message that I hand wrote and scanned and uploaded. But
then I'm like, what is it? And then I looked at it, I'm like KG. I'm like, that look Kaushik Gopal. I'm like, maybe this is Kaushik. And I'm like, and that's when I texted you. I'm like, did you send me something? And you're just like, oh yeah. And I'm like, oh, dude, scared the crap out of me, man.
I have quite a few domain names. I started out with kaushikgopal.com, but then I thought that was too long. So then I moved to kaush.co. Then I moved to jkl.gg. That's the scary one. That's the one that people
full on sketch.
I know. Then I got kaushik.page and kaush.page.
Okay.
And my family was giving me a lot of grief about this because obviously my emails keep changing and they're like, what the hell is wrong with you, right? Like just pick something. I think I've finally reached the domain name that I like, and I'm going to stick with this, like, and hold me to it. Like, if 6 months later I come and say, you should point me to this episode and tell me I'm a moron.
Mm-hmm.
The domain name is kau.sh.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it's not taken. I thought that was taken by that guy that did Visor.
Yeah. So he has kaush.com.
Oh, okay. Very, very, okay. Very similar. Okay.
So that was like, but I managed to snag this one.
SH, that is phenomenal as a developer, like domain too.
I know. I was very proud and I was like, oh my God. So that's what I was like. This was like late night. I was just doing something and I was like, I wonder if it's available. And I opened up Namecheap. It was available. I'm like, oh my God. I'm
7 hours later.
Now. Yeah. But I've kind of committed to like, okay, this is good. I'm happy. There's like, I don't have any qualms with it, and I'm going to stick with this for some time. So anyway, folks can reach out there. There's information on my contact page there. Just go hammer.
Is your theme going to be like a shell terminal?
No. Right now, I actually.
That joke.
No. Like, I that's also something I spend way too much time on. I actually have a Hugo theme called Henry that I spend way more time than is responsible, but it's like my outlet, and so. I did recently change the theme too with the domain name change. So folks can go there and, reach out to me.
Awesome.
Thank you all for listening. Thanks, Don. I think this was fun and I'm eager to see the feedback, and I will catch you in the next episode.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everybody. Before you get going, don't forget to check out my free course on Git. This is going to be the course that shows you everything that you need to know in order to get started. It is the 80-20 of Git. You'll learn the 20% of commands are going to give you well over 80% of the benefit. Heck, I'd even say over 90% of the benefit. In fact, these are the commands that I use every single day, and I rarely step out of these boundaries. To learn more and to watch the course, you can go to donfelker.com/git or just go to donfelker.com/YouTube and check it out there for free. I really hope you enjoy it.
That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Donn Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.